Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. There is a strange political story coming out of South Carolina this week. A woman who is currently serving in the United States Senate was asked a very basic question about Taiwan and the South China Sea. Her answer was blunt. She admitted that national security was not really her area of expertise. Now, you might think this is just another political gaffe, another candidate who was caught off guard by a difficult question. But I think there is something much bigger hiding behind this story. Because the question isn't simply whether one Senate candidate knows enough about Taiwan. The real question is this: does Washington still have a clear strategy for Taiwan? And perhaps even more importantly, is Taiwan becoming a bargaining chip in America's larger competition with China? That is a much more serious question. And it comes at a particularly interesting moment. The candidate in question is Darline Graham, the interim senator from South Carolina and the sister of the late Senator Lindsey Graham. She is now running to keep the seat permanently. During a Republican primary debate, she was asked whether Taiwan and the South China Sea represent a national security interest for the United States. Her response immediately became the headline. She said she was not that informed on national security. Her opponent, Representative Ralph Norman, gave a more conventional Republican answer, talking about peace through strength, semiconductor chips, and the danger of a weak American president. But even the Wall Street Journal's editorial analysis argued that Norman's answer wasn't exactly a model of strategic clarity either. And that is where this story becomes interesting. Because if this were simply about one inexperienced politician, I wouldn't spend much time on it. Politicians make mistakes. But Taiwan is not some obscure foreign policy issue. For the United States, Taiwan sits at the center of one of the most consequential strategic questions of the 21st century: how America is going to deal with a rising China in the Indo-Pacific. And that's why I think we need to look beyond Darline Graham. Because the problem isn't that every American politician needs to become a China expert. The problem is that Washington itself appears increasingly divided over what Taiwan actually means to America. For decades, American policy toward Taiwan has rested on a carefully constructed ambiguity. Washington recognizes the People's Republic of China diplomatically while maintaining unofficial relations with Taiwan. The United States does not formally promise that it will automatically go to war if China attacks Taiwan. But at the same time, Washington provides Taiwan with weapons, maintains close unofficial relations with Taipei, and repeatedly signals that an attempt to change the status quo by force would have enormous consequences. The purpose of this ambiguity is relatively simple. You want Beijing to believe that an attack could trigger an American response. But you also don't want to give Beijing a perfectly predictable answer that allows it to plan around American policy. At the same time, you don't want Taipei to believe that American military intervention is guaranteed under every circumstance. It is an inherently uncomfortable strategy. But strategic ambiguity has survived for decades precisely because the alternative can be even more dangerous. Now, however, something appears to be changing, and Donald Trump is a major part of that change. Trump does not approach foreign policy in exactly the same way as the traditional American foreign policy establishment. He tends to think in terms of leverage. What does America have? What does the other side want? What can Washington use as a bargaining chip? And what can America get in return? That approach can sometimes produce results. But Taiwan is an unusually dangerous place to apply it. Because Taiwan is not simply another item on a trade negotiation, it is connected to America's military position in the Western Pacific, Japan's security, the Philippines, the credibility of American alliances, semiconductor supply chains, and the broader balance of power between the United States and China. And that brings us to Elbridge Colby. Colby has become one of the most important strategic thinkers inside the Trump administration's defense establishment. And here's where I think we need to be careful. Some commentators have interpreted his arguments as essentially saying that Taiwan can be sacrificed or traded away. I think that interpretation goes too far. Colby's actual strategic framework is more complicated. His argument is that Taiwan is strategically important, but the core American interest is not necessarily Taiwan itself at any cost. The larger American objective, in his framework, is preventing China from establishing regional hegemony in Asia. That distinction matters, because saying Taiwan is important but the United States should not fight an unlimited war over Taiwan is not the same thing as saying America should hand Taiwan to Beijing in exchange for a deal. Those are two completely different propositions, and we should not confuse them. In fact, Colby has recently continued to argue that the United States is not withdrawing from Asia. He has emphasized a strategy of deterrence by denial along the first island chain, including Taiwan, while also insisting that American allies and partners need to carry more of the defense burden themselves. So the more interesting question is not, is Colby secretly planning to trade Taiwan to China? There isn't enough evidence to make that claim. The more serious question is, what is America actually willing to pay to prevent China from taking Taiwan? That is the debate Washington needs to have. Because deterrence isn't created by saying Taiwan is important. Deterrence depends on capability, credibility, and willingness. If Beijing believes America has the military capability to respond, but no willingness to accept the cost of doing so, deterrence becomes weaker. And if Beijing believes America is willing to fight, but doesn't have the military capability to win, deterrence can also become unstable. That is why the debate over Taiwan is ultimately a debate over American credibility. And this is where the $14 billion Taiwan arms package becomes important. The package has been caught in a political and strategic limbo, with Trump having delayed its transmission to Congress after discussions with Chinese President Xi Jinping. More recently, senior Republican lawmakers have said they expect the package to move forward. Now, supporters of Taiwan will naturally say, America should sell the weapons immediately. Critics may say, America shouldn't allow Taiwan to drag the United States into a war with China. But there is another question. What happens when Beijing knows that Washington is willing to delay or accelerate weapons sales depending on the broader U.S.-China relationship? At that point, the weapons themselves become more than weapons. They become signals, they become leverage, and potentially, they become bargaining tools. This is why the issue is so sensitive. Let's imagine two different versions of American policy. In the first version, Washington says, we want peace in the Taiwan Strait. We want Taiwan to defend itself. We oppose unilateral changes to the status quo. And if China uses force, Beijing should understand that the consequences could be severe. That's deterrence. In the second version, Washington says, we can increase or decrease support for Taiwan depending on what China gives us on trade, technology, tariffs, or other issues. That is something very different. The first strategy uses Taiwan to deter China. The second risks turning Taiwan into leverage against China. And Beijing will notice the difference immediately. This is why I think the most important issue is not whether Taiwan is a bargaining chip. The real issue is whether Washington is beginning to treat Taiwan as one. Those two statements sound similar, but they are not. A bargaining chip is useful only if you are prepared to give it up. And that creates a dangerous strategic problem. Suppose Washington signals to Beijing that Taiwan can be part of a broader deal. What happens next? Beijing doesn't necessarily have to accept the deal. It can simply wait. It can apply pressure. It can increase military activity around Taiwan. It can raise the economic and political cost of America's commitment. And it can test how much Washington is really willing to spend to defend the status quo. In other words, once you signal that something is negotiable, the other side has an incentive to negotiate harder. And this is why China may actually prefer clarity from Washington. Beijing can deal with an American policy it strongly dislikes if that policy is predictable. What is much harder to deal with is a policy that changes according to the latest negotiation. That is particularly important right now because U.S.-China relations are no longer defined by one issue. There are trade disputes. There are technology restrictions. There are semiconductor controls. There are military tensions. There is the South China Sea. There is Taiwan. And there are broader negotiations over the future balance of power in Asia. Taiwan sits in the middle of all of them. That's why a decision involving Taiwan can have consequences far beyond Taiwan. And this brings us back to Darline Graham. Her mistake is revealing not because one senator needs to know every detail of Asian geopolitics. It is revealing because it raises a question about the people who will eventually make these decisions. A senator doesn't need to be an expert in every subject, but senators vote on defense budgets. They vote on arms sales. They vote on sanctions. They vote on military deployments. They vote on treaties and international agreements. And if Taiwan becomes the flashpoint in a US-China crisis, members of Congress may suddenly find themselves making decisions that could affect the entire global economy. So yes, it is fair to ask whether someone running for the United States Senate should understand why Taiwan matters. But I don't think the lesson should be, Republicans are stupid. That would be far too easy. And it would also miss the bigger story. Because Democrats have their own problems. Progressive politicians have also struggled at times to explain what exactly the United States should do if China attempts to blockade or invade Taiwan. And that tells us something important. The uncertainty over Taiwan is not simply a Republican problem. It is an American problem. There is a growing divide between three different ways of thinking about Taiwan. The first says, Taiwan is a vital American interest, and the United States must be prepared to defend it. The second says, Taiwan is strategically important, but the United States should avoid an unnecessary war with China and push Taiwan and other regional allies to do far more for their own defense. And the third says, Taiwan matters, but it is ultimately less important than avoiding a major US-China war. Those three positions can sound similar during a political speech, but they lead to very different decisions during a crisis. And that is the real debate America needs. Because there is a danger in pretending that every politician who supports Taiwan means exactly the same thing. They don't. Some mean military defense. Some mean arms sales. Some mean deterrence. Some mean economic pressure. Some mean strategic ambiguity. Some mean strategic clarity. And some may simply mean that Taiwan is useful leverage in negotiations with Beijing. Those are not interchangeable policies. So, where do I think Trump fits into this? Trump is difficult to categorize because he has simultaneously emphasized American strength and questioned traditional assumptions about alliances and overseas commitments. He wants allies to spend more. He wants Taiwan to do more. He wants China to understand that America has enormous leverage. But he also wants the freedom to negotiate directly with Xi Jinping. That combination creates both an opportunity and a risk. The opportunity is that Trump may be able to use economic and military leverage to force China into negotiations that previous administrations couldn't achieve. The risk is that Beijing may begin to believe that America's commitment to Taiwan is conditional on whatever larger deal Trump wants. And that could undermine deterrence. Think about it from Beijing's perspective. If America says, we will defend the status quo, that's one thing. If America says, we will defend the status quo unless there is a sufficiently attractive deal with Beijing, that's another. And if Beijing believes the second version is true, it may start asking, how much pressure does it take to change Washington's calculation? That is a dangerous question. Because deterrence works partly through uncertainty. But there is a difference between strategic ambiguity and strategic uncertainty about America's own objectives. Strategic ambiguity is deliberate. Strategic confusion is not. And this is where I think Washington needs to be very careful. America doesn't necessarily need to promise Taiwan that it will fight China under every circumstance. In fact, I don't think such a promise would necessarily make the region safer. But America does need to know what it is trying to prevent. If the answer is simply, we don't want war, that isn't a strategy. If the answer is, we want Taiwan to remain free, but won't explain what we are willing to do, that's incomplete. And if the answer is Taiwan can be traded for a better relationship with Beijing, then Washington needs to understand the enormous consequences of that decision. Because the consequences would not stop in Taiwan. Japan would be watching. South Korea would be watching. The Philippines would be watching. Australia would be watching. India would be watching. And America's European allies would be watching too. They would all be asking the same question. If Washington is willing to abandon or trade away a partner in the most important strategic theater in Asia, what does that tell us about America's commitments elsewhere? That is why Taiwan is bigger than Taiwan. And that is also why the semiconductor argument, while important, is not enough. Yes, Taiwan is home to an extraordinarily important semiconductor industry. But Taiwan's strategic significance isn't simply about computer chips. It is about geography. It is about the first island chain. It is about the balance of power in the Western Pacific. It is about China's ability to project military power beyond its immediate coastline. And it is about whether the United States remains the dominant external security power in the Indo-Pacific. That doesn't mean America must fight every war everywhere. It means Washington needs to understand the consequences before deciding what it is willing to trade. And perhaps this is the biggest lesson from the Darline-Graham controversy. The problem isn't that every senator must be a foreign policy intellectual. The problem is that America cannot afford to have no clear answer when the question is one of the most consequential strategic decisions it may face this century. If Taiwan becomes a bargaining chip, Washington needs to understand what happens when the other side starts bargaining. If Taiwan is a strategic asset, Washington needs to understand what it is willing to spend to protect that asset. And if Taiwan is neither worth a war nor disposable as a bargaining chip, then America needs to define exactly where that middle ground lies. Because right now, the debate in Washington sometimes sounds less like a coherent strategy and more like a collection of competing instincts. Strength, restraint, deterrence, negotiation, America first, alliance commitments. All of these ideas can coexist, but only if there is a clear hierarchy among them. Otherwise, the United States may send one message to Taiwan, another to China, and a third to its allies. And that is how deterrence begins to break down. So, I don't think the biggest story here is that one Senate candidate couldn't answer a question about Taiwan. The bigger story is that America itself is still struggling with the question behind that question. What exactly is Taiwan to the United States? A partner? A strategic position? A symbol of the rules-based order? A critical economic hub? A potential battlefield? Or a bargaining chip? The answer matters. Because once a country becomes a bargaining chip, someone has to be willing to put it on the table. And once you put it on the table, you don't completely control what happens next. That is why the debate over Taiwan isn't really about whether America should be tough or weak on China. It is about whether Washington has a strategy that is clear enough to deter Beijing without unnecessarily creating a war and flexible enough to negotiate without accidentally destroying the credibility that makes negotiation possible in the first place. And that may be the hardest balancing act Donald Trump faces in the Indo-Pacific. Not deciding whether Taiwan matters, but deciding how much Taiwan matters and making sure Beijing, Taipei, and America's allies all understand exactly where that line is. Thanks for watching.